It was one of those days that felt like it had been stretched too thin, like the minutes were slipping away faster than I could catch them. I had been working late, caught in the endless loop of meetings and deadlines, so when the workday finally came to an end, I couldn't wait to get home. The evening sky had just begun to darken when I stepped onto the platform, the low hum of the train station filling the air. The usual sounds of the city, the distant traffic, the chatter of people, were all muted, swallowed up by the pressing quiet that seemed to linger just beyond the station. I didn't think much about it at the time, but when I saw the train pull into the station, something about it felt off. It was the same model, the same colors, everything exactly like the ones that passed through every day. But for some reason, I felt a strange unease settle in my chest. I couldn't place it. Maybe it was just the fatigue, or maybe it was the way the train seemed to glide in too smoothly, too silently. But there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. I shrugged off the feeling, telling myself I was just tired, and stepped aboard. The interior of the train was almost empty, save for a few commuters scattered around. I slid into my usual seat by the window, sinking into the familiar comfort of the worn fabric. The train doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and we were off, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks beneath us lulling me into a half-daze. The city began to recede, the buildings blurring into the darkening horizon, the familiar streets replaced by the open landscape. The lights from the station faded, replaced by the occasional flicker of street lamps as we moved farther out of town. At first, I thought nothing of it. The train continued on its usual route, the glow of the stations passing by like blinked-out stars. But as we ventured deeper into the outskirts, something felt wrong. The further we went, the fewer lights there were, and the further apart the stops became. The landscape outside the window shifted, the cityscape turning into fields and stretches of empty land. And then, without warning, the train slowed. I looked up from my phone, my brow furrowing. We weren't approaching a station, and there hadn't been any announcement. The train's brakes hissed, and then it stopped completely, the silence in the car suddenly too loud. The soft hum of the lights, the gentle sway of the train, all of it seemed to freeze. The landscape outside the window had gone completely dark, the only illumination the faint glow of the train's lights reflecting off the tracks. I glanced around at the few passengers still aboard, but they were all as silent as I felt. No one seemed concerned. No one moved. The train sat motionless in the dark, as though we had been abandoned. There wasn't a station in sight, just the empty stretch of tracks cutting through an endless void of darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just a delay, maybe something with the engine or a signal issue. But the unease in my chest grew. My phone had no signal, and there were no announcements, no way of knowing what was happening or how long we'd be stuck here. I stood up, unsure if I should do something. Go to the conductor, check the door, anything, but there was no movement from the other passengers. No one was speaking. They were all sitting, looking straight ahead, their eyes vacant, their bodies still. It was like they were waiting for something. I walked toward the front of the train, past the empty seats, until I reached the door to the conductor's cabin. I knocked softly, but there was no answer. I turned the handle, only to find it locked. I pressed my ear against the door, hoping to hear something, anything, but all I could hear was the faint, steady pulse of the train's power. Everything else was eerily still. I returned to my seat, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me, the stillness of the train thick and suffocating. I glanced out the window again, but the view had changed. The tracks no longer seemed to lead anywhere. The night outside was no longer just dark, it was an unbroken black void, stretching on forever. No trees, no fields, no distant lights, just an infinite darkness. And then, in that darkness, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something moving in the distance, but it was so faint, so far away, that I couldn't make it out. But as I focused, I saw it clearer, figures, standing still in the distance, just beyond the reach of the train's lights. They weren't moving, just standing, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for the train to stop, to let them aboard. But there was no station. No platform. No reason for them to be there. My heart pounded in my chest. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me, but the figures didn't go away. They were still there, their shapes faint but clear, standing just beyond the tracks in the darkness. There was something unsettling about them, something about the way they stood so still, like they weren't part of the world, like they didn't belong here at all. I tried to look away, to turn my focus back to the inside of the train, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window, to the figures that were still there. And then, as the train sat motionless, I noticed something even stranger. The landscape outside had shifted again. The tracks weren't straight anymore. They bent, winding off into the dark, disappearing into a forest of trees that weren't supposed to be there. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of the figures, the landscape, or why the train had stopped in the middle of nowhere, in a place that shouldn't exist. It was a quiet evening when I first saw her, and the world felt just a little too still. I was sitting at my usual corner table at the cafe, staring out at the street through the fogged-up window. The light from the lamps outside cast long, soft shadows, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, as it always did. I was lost in my thoughts, trying to shake off the weight of the day, when I noticed her. She was standing by the door, as if she'd just stepped in from the rain. Her coat was damp, and her hair clung to her face, wet from the drizzle outside. She wasn't someone I recognized, not at all, but there was something about her presence that felt familiar. Something in the way she carried herself, in the way her eyes scanned the room, like she was searching for something, or someone. And then, she looked directly at me. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe it was just the dim light or the exhaustion playing tricks on me. But she kept her gaze fixed on me, her eyes narrowing slightly, like she knew something I didn't. A chill crept up my spine. I couldn't understand why, but there was a strange tug in my chest, like my body was remembering something I couldn't quite recall. She took a few steps toward my table, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. I couldn't look away, my heart beating a little faster than it should have been. And then, she spoke. "I knew you'd be here," she said, her voice calm and steady, but her words sent an unexpected shiver through me. "I'm sorry," I said, my throat suddenly dry. "I think you've got the wrong person." She didn't seem surprised. She just smiled, a small, almost knowing smile, and took a seat across from me without asking. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked. Her gaze didn't waver, and it felt like she was peering straight into me, into places I hadn't allowed anyone to see. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. She wasn't wrong, I had never seen her before. Not in this lifetime, at least. But there was something hauntingly familiar about her, like a memory that sat just on the edge of recall, out of reach, but close enough to stir something deep within me. "No," I said finally, "I don't think I do." She nodded, as though this was the answer she'd been expecting. "That's okay," she said softly, and then she looked down at her hands, folding them neatly on the table. "You will. Eventually." I stared at her, unable to shake the growing sense of discomfort that had settled in my stomach. The air around us felt thicker now, heavier, like the weight of an unspoken truth was hanging between us. I didn't know why, but I felt like I needed to leave, to stand up and walk away, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I didn't know what she meant. Eventually? What did that even mean? "I know it's strange," she continued, breaking the silence, "but I've been waiting for you." My mind raced. Waited for me? Who was this woman? What did she know about me? And why did it feel like I was supposed to know her too? But as much as I tried to search for any memory of her, I couldn't find anything. No connection, no shared past, nothing to explain why she seemed so familiar. "I don't understand," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I've never seen you before in my life. You're not someone I know." She tilted her head, looking almost sympathetic. Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, I saw something else there, something distant, like she was seeing beyond the present, beyond this moment we were sharing. "You've seen me," she said slowly. "Just not like this. Not yet." I blinked, confusion swirling in my chest. "What do you mean?" Her lips parted as if she were about to explain, but she hesitated, her eyes distant for a moment. When she spoke again, it was softer, quieter, like she was sharing a secret. "You've forgotten," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you will remember. It's always been like this. You just haven't caught up yet." I didn't know how to respond. I was stunned, my thoughts tangled, trying to make sense of the words she was saying. She was looking at me with that same unsettling smile, her eyes steady, unwavering. The more she spoke, the more I felt like I was unraveling, like my whole sense of reality was shifting. Her presence felt like an anchor, but one that was dragging me deeper into something I couldn't understand. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice breaking this time. I wanted to run, but I couldn't bring myself to stand. "I've never met you. I've never seen you before." She looked at me with those eyes, and for the first time, I saw something flash behind them, something darker, something older. "You will," she said again, and there was a finality to it now, as though she knew more than I did, as if she had always known how this was going to unfold. Before I could ask another question, she stood up, her movements smooth and deliberate. She paused, glancing at me one last time with that knowing smile before she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving me sitting there, breathless and confused. I stayed at the table for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she had been, trying to grasp what had just happened. There were no answers, no explanations. Just the lingering feeling that she was right, and that I was trapped in something I couldn't escape, something I didn't even remember beginning. The cafe around me felt strange now, like the whole world had shifted in a way that didn't make sense. I looked around, hoping to see someone, anyone who might have noticed what had just happened, but everyone seemed perfectly content, moving through their lives as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that I had seen her before, somewhere, sometime, long before tonight. And that somewhere, somehow, she knew me better than I knew myself. I didn't leave the cafe right away. Instead, I pulled out my phone, and for the first time, I searched for her name. There was nothing. No trace of her anywhere. Just an empty, hollow search result that told me I was looking for someone who didn't exist. But when I looked at the photo of myself that popped up, the one I hadn't uploaded, the one I hadn't even seen before, I recognized her face in the reflection. She had been waiting for me. It started as a normal evening, the kind where the world feels just a little too quiet. The city was alive with the usual sounds, the low hum of distant cars, the faint chatter of people walking by, but there was something off about the way it all felt, something that gnawed at me from the moment I stepped outside. It was like the evening had an edge to it, a thin thread of unease I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe I had been too deep in my own head all day, but the moment I walked out onto the street, something didn't feel right. I was walking home from work, the routine almost comforting. The street was familiar, too familiar. I had walked it countless times, but today, it felt different. The buildings seemed taller than I remembered, the streetlights brighter. The shadows were longer, stretching out at odd angles, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just my imagination. But as I moved further down the street, the feeling of disorientation grew stronger, like I wasn't moving the way I thought I was. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint what exactly had shifted. But everything looked the same. The corner store, the small cafe where I always stopped for coffee, the narrow alley where I'd cut through dozens of times. They were all in place, just as they had always been. But the longer I walked, the more the world around me seemed to lose focus. It was like the street was starting to bend, the edges blurring at the periphery of my vision. The buildings began to shimmer, not in the way sunlight shimmers on hot pavement, but like something was gently distorting the air itself. The colors bled into each other, the shapes of the buildings melting into the pavement. The sidewalk beneath my feet felt like it was shifting with every step I took, like I wasn't sure if I was moving forward or backward anymore. I stopped, a sudden wave of dizziness washing over me. The street, once so clearly defined in my mind, was no longer the same. The familiar landmarks had lost their certainty. I looked ahead, trying to focus, but the streetlights flickered and buzzed, their light dimming and brightening erratically. The distance between the buildings seemed to stretch, and the corner where I usually turned felt farther away than it should have been. And then it hit me. I wasn't walking forward. I was walking backwards. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I had been moving in the wrong direction. I tried to stop myself, to pivot around, but my legs wouldn't listen. My body, it seemed, had its own rhythm, its own idea of where I needed to go. I couldn't remember when I had started walking backwards. I couldn't remember the last time I had made a conscious decision about the direction I was heading. The pavement beneath my feet felt unfamiliar, as if I had never walked here before, but the buildings, the street, everything around me was exactly the same as it had been a few moments ago. I glanced behind me, the street I had just passed looking even more distorted now. The light from the street lamps was wrong, casting strange, uneven shadows across the sidewalk. I saw a figure in the distance, a person walking towards me, but as they moved closer, I couldn't make out their features. They were blurry, a shadow, like a half-forgotten memory trying to take shape. I tried to call out, to stop them, but my voice felt thin, distant. It didn't sound like it was coming from me. I opened my mouth again, but the words felt stuck in my throat. The figure continued toward me, but as they drew closer, I realized they weren't walking toward me, they were walking alongside me, matching my every step. I turned my head, but there was no one there. Just the same empty street, the same warped shadows, the same blurring world around me. The figure was still walking beside me, just out of the corner of my vision. But now it felt different, more oppressive. Like they were pulling at me, tethering me to this strange, shifting world. I tried to shake it off, tried to walk faster, but my legs were still moving backwards, slowly, deliberately, as if some unseen force was controlling my every move. The buildings around me were beginning to fade, their outlines softening, like smoke curling into the night. The streetlights flickered again, casting long, unnatural shadows on the ground, and I could hear the distant sound of footsteps. Not just mine, but others, footsteps that didn't belong to me, footsteps that weren't mine to follow. I looked up, desperately trying to focus, and that's when I saw it. The street ahead of me had disappeared entirely. There was nothing but an endless stretch of gray, the air thick with the strange sense of unreality. There were no more buildings, no more landmarks, just an empty, unending expanse stretching out before me. I stopped moving. I couldn't make myself take another step, couldn't make my feet move forward or backward. I was stuck, caught in the middle of something I couldn't understand. The footsteps behind me grew louder now, and the figure that had been walking alongside me was closer. I couldn't see their face, but I felt them moving right next to me, their presence so heavy, so close. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. I didn't know how much time had passed, but when I finally turned to face the direction I thought was ahead, the street had returned. The buildings were back, the familiar storefronts and streetlights. The world had snapped back into place, and everything was exactly as it should have been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly been walking forwards or backwards. That I had never truly moved at all. That the street, the world around me, was only appearing as it had always been. It was like I had crossed some invisible line, walked through something I couldn't see, and now I was back, but not really. I walked the rest of the way home, my feet heavy, the sound of my steps now painfully real against the pavement. The streets were quiet again, and as I turned the final corner, I could hear nothing but my breath, my footsteps, and the soft rustling of the wind. But when I reached my door, I felt it, the sensation of something behind me, something that had been with me the whole time. I looked over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Only the empty street, the shadows stretching long into the distance. And in the silence, I realized that no matter how far I walked, no matter which direction I took, I would always feel the pull of something moving behind me. Always walking backward, always following, always a step behind. It started on a rainy afternoon, the kind of weather that makes everything feel a little too still. The rain tapped softly against the window, and the faint smell of wet earth drifted in through the cracks in the old building where I worked. I was at the library again, my usual retreat when the day felt too overwhelming, a place where the silence was almost a comfort, where the scent of paper and dust filled the air like old memories. I hadn't planned to be there long. I was on my lunch break, and I had simply walked in to escape the noise of the office, to clear my mind for a few minutes. The shelves of books seemed to close in around me, the aisles stretching out like quiet paths, each corner a promise of something new to discover. I wandered down the rows, my fingers brushing against the spines of books I'd never read, their titles half faded by time. That's when I found it. It was tucked in the corner of a shelf, hidden behind a row of thick, well-worn books. At first, I thought it was just another old novel, perhaps forgotten by time, its cover frayed and pages yellowed. But then, I saw the title. My Name. I'm not exaggerating. The book was titled The Life of My Name. The words were simple, printed in bold letters across the worn cover, the font old and curling with age, like it had been there far longer than any book had a right to be. I reached out instinctively, my fingers hovering over the cover. It felt wrong to touch it. The book wasn't mine, and yet, it was. There was something eerie about it, something that didn't sit right in my chest. I pulled it off the shelf, the pages heavy in my hands, the leather of the cover cracked in places. It was strange. I'd been in this library dozens of times, and I was sure I'd never seen this book before. How had I missed it? I opened the first page, and the words jumped out at me. The writing was elegant, almost like a forgotten manuscript, neat and careful. But the words, it was as though I had written them. Born in the summer of 1990, my name, grew up in a small town. The smell of rain on hot pavement was the most vivid memory of childhood, a memory that stuck with them for years to come. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The description was too familiar, too precise. I had grown up in a small town, and I could distinctly remember the smell of rain on pavement. I never spoke of it to anyone. It was just something I held on to, buried deep in the recesses of my mind. I turned the page, my fingers trembling. The first real challenge of my name's life came at the age of 15. That was when they found themselves staring down a future they didn't understand, caught between the life they knew and the unknown that was waiting. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't possible. How could it know these things? The memory of that time, when I had faced uncertainty, when I'd felt torn between expectations and my own desires, it was so vividly captured in the words, but I had never told anyone about it. No one had ever known. I had locked those feelings away, kept them to myself, buried them deep inside where no one could find them. I flipped through the book quickly now, scanning the pages. Each one was filled with details from my life, my childhood, my teenage years, the struggles I had gone through, even the smallest moments I had long since forgotten. There was no doubt about it. The words described my life, but in a way that I hadn't written. And there were more details I didn't understand. Things I didn't remember, but that the book seemed to know. People I had never met, places I had never been, yet there they were, described in vivid detail, like pieces of a puzzle that had been pulled from the depths of my mind and laid out before me. When they turned 27, my name made a decision that would change everything. It was a choice made in the dead of night, under the flicker of streetlights. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. The description of the night I made the decision to leave my old life behind, to take a leap into the unknown, was eerily accurate. I had never told anyone about that night. Not in detail, anyway. It was a choice I had made in secret, in a moment of vulnerability, alone and unsure. And yet, here it was, laid out in the pages of this book, as if it had been seen, as if someone else had been there with me. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing in the quiet library, and rushed out of the aisle. I needed to get away from it. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My thoughts were clouded with 1,000 questions. Who wrote this? How could this exist? Why do I feel like I've seen it before? I didn't go back to my office that day. Instead, I went home, the book heavy in my bag, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I had to know more. I had to figure out what this was, why it felt like someone had written my life for me, or worse, like I had somehow written it for myself without remembering. That night, I sat up in bed, the book resting in my lap. I opened it again, more carefully this time, flipping through the pages, stopping at random points to read the words that seemed so familiar, so impossible. As I read, I realized something strange. There were gaps, empty spaces. The pages weren't complete. There were things left unsaid, moments I could not recall, events that were written but never explained. And then I found it, something that made my blood run cold. The final chapter will be written soon. My name will reach a crossroads, and they will have to choose a path that leads them to the truth about everything. It will be the hardest decision they've ever faced. The ending will come, and they will know, at last, the purpose of this book. I closed the book quickly, my hands shaking. The last chapter was still unwritten. The final decision, the one I had yet to face, was still ahead of me. But how could the book know that? How could it know my life so thoroughly, so completely, and yet leave the final part unwritten? I didn't know what to do with the book. I didn't know how to explain it, or if I even wanted to. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that perhaps I wasn't the one who was supposed to write the end of the story. Perhaps the book had already written it for me. I'm not sure how long it's been since that night, but the book has stayed with me, hidden in a drawer. I've kept it, and every now and then, I wonder about the final chapter. I wonder if the ending is already written, if my life has already been mapped out, or if I still have a choice. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch myself flipping through its pages, searching for clues, looking for a way to understand why this book exists, and why it has such a hold on me. I don't know if I'll ever finish it. But I can't help but wonder, what happens when the last page is finally turned? The evening was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. I was sitting on the porch, the cool air brushing against my skin as I looked out over the empty street. It was a peaceful neighborhood, the sort of place where the sound of distant traffic and the hum of everyday life blend into the background, barely noticeable. But tonight, it felt like something was missing. I had been reading, trying to relax after a long week, but something kept tugging at my attention. The air felt heavier than usual, the silence pressing in around me, almost suffocating. I glanced up at the sky. Clouds had gathered, dark and heavy, but there was no rain. It was as though the weather itself was waiting for something. And then I heard it. The sound, faint at first, like a whisper in the distance. A siren. I paused, unsure if I had imagined it. The sirens in our neighborhood were rare, something that happened only during emergencies or the occasional late-night accident. But tonight, the sound was different. It wasn't just one siren, it was a chorus of them, echoing through the streets, growing louder with each passing second. But there was no movement. No lights flashing down the road, no cars speeding past. No sign of what was causing the noise. I stood up, my eyes scanning the street. It was empty. The sidewalks were deserted, the houses dark and quiet, as though everyone had vanished. Even the streetlights seemed dim, flickering weakly in the gathering darkness. I stepped off the porch, the sound of the sirens growing louder with each step. It was so close now that the wail of the emergency vehicles felt like it was right outside, but when I looked around, there was nothing. No fire trucks. No ambulances. Not a single vehicle in sight. I walked down the street, my heart beginning to race. The sound was deafening now, filling my ears, but still, there was nothing to explain it. I turned the corner, hoping to see some sort of action, some sign that things were normal, but the street was as empty as the one I had just left. No people. No cars. No lights. Just the relentless sound of the sirens, echoing from somewhere I couldn't place. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just some glitch, a misplaced emergency vehicle heading to another part of town. But even as I walked, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of wrongness. It wasn't just the sirens anymore, it was the silence of the streets, the way everything felt suspended, like the world was out of sync, a moment frozen in time. I turned down another street, the sound of the sirens now painfully close, ringing in my head. I almost expected to turn a corner and find the emergency vehicles parked there, people rushing around, chaos unfolding as it always does. But instead, I was met with more emptiness. The street was still empty, the houses still quiet. By now, I felt dizzy, like I was walking through some sort of dream. The sound of the sirens seemed to follow me, a constant, oppressive presence, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find the source. I looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was no one. No neighbors looking out their windows, no one walking down the street. Just me, lost in a sea of sound and silence. The sirens didn't stop. They kept getting louder and louder, until I couldn't tell if they were real or if they were just in my head. It felt like the whole world had become a blur, and I was the only one left who could hear it, trapped in this strange, unending wail. I didn't know how long I'd been walking. My legs felt heavy, my mind foggy. My heart was pounding, but there was no escape. The sound of the sirens was suffocating, the noise closing in around me, but the streets remained empty. It was like I was walking in a loop, like I had stepped out of time itself, unable to leave or move forward. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. Just like that. 1 second it was there, filling every corner of the street, and the next it was gone. The silence that followed was thick, heavier than before, like the world had been holding its breath and had finally exhaled. I froze, standing in the middle of the street, unsure of what had just happened. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. The sirens were gone, but the weight of them still lingered, the strange emptiness of the street pressing in on me. I turned around, ready to head back home, but something stopped me. I looked at the sky again. The clouds were still there, dark and heavy, but the air felt different now. Charged, somehow. The streets still looked the same, empty, quiet. But now, they felt wrong. As though something had shifted, something I couldn't quite understand. Something had been broken, and I had witnessed it. I hurried back home, my feet moving faster than they should have been, my eyes darting around the darkening street. When I reached my front porch, I turned back to look down the road one last time. The street was empty, just as it had always been. But in the distance, I could still hear it. The faint echo of the sirens, still ringing, still fading, but never really gone. And I couldn't help but wonder, what had I just walked through? What had just happened in the silence? I had been out running errands all afternoon, moving through the city's familiar streets with the weight of the day pressing on me. It was one of those gray afternoons where the sky hangs low and heavy, the kind of weather that makes everything feel a little too quiet, a little too still. The hustle of the city seemed muffled, as if the sound had been turned down, and the streets were emptier than usual. I wasn't in a rush to get home, but when I took a wrong turn, I found myself standing in front of a narrow alleyway that I'd walked past countless times. It was the kind of alley that people usually avoid. The walls were cracked and graffiti covered, the ground littered with bits of trash that hadn't been cleaned in who knows how long. It wasn't a place anyone would choose to walk through if they didn't have to. But something about it called to me this time. I glanced down the alley, the flickering light from a street lamp casting odd shadows against the walls. I hadn't been in this alley for months, but for some reason, I felt a pull, as if something was waiting for me there. I stood for a moment, half wondering why I even thought about stepping into it, but the quiet atmosphere seemed to invite me in. I shrugged, my feet carrying me forward, feeling the cool breeze as I walked into the alley. The walls on either side seemed to close in, making the space feel smaller, more oppressive. It was a short alleyway, no more than 30 feet long, but the deeper I went, the more I felt a sense of unease settle in my chest. The alley had always felt empty before, but now, it felt like something was hidden just out of sight, something waiting. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the end, but when I turned the corner, I felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't where I had been before. The street ahead of me was different. The buildings were the same, but they were older, worn, as if they had been here longer than they should have. The alley had ended at a street, but not the street I had walked down earlier. It was a narrow, almost forgotten street with cobblestone pavement and dim streetlights, casting a pale glow on the empty sidewalks. The air felt heavier here, the quiet more profound. The buildings on the street looked like they had been abandoned, windows boarded up, doors hanging ajar as if they hadn't seen life in years. I turned back to look at the alley, but the entrance I had just walked through had disappeared. Where the alley had been, there was only an old brick wall, smooth and unbroken, as though the alley had never existed at all. My heart began to race. I turned in a circle, trying to understand what had just happened. I had been walking in that alley not more than 15 minutes ago, but now, standing on this strange street, it felt as if hours had passed. I felt disoriented, disconnected, like I was trapped in a place I couldn't escape from. The quiet was suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch too far, curling around the buildings and the street like tendrils that reached out to grab me. I took a step forward, my mind racing for some sort of explanation. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I had just left the alley, I had seen it with my own eyes, and yet now it was gone. The street was different, the alley had changed, and I had no idea how I had ended up here. I walked forward, my feet shuffling against the cobblestones, my hands clenched into fists as I tried to push the panic down. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the fatigue had caught up with me. I had been running errands for hours, walking for what felt like forever. But the more I tried to explain it to myself, the worse the feeling grew. The street was still empty, but now I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. That something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. I could almost hear the whisper of footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was no one. The sound of distant voices caught my attention, and I looked down the street. Someone was walking toward me, a figure slowly emerging from the shadows. They were walking toward me with purpose, their footsteps slow but steady, echoing in the otherwise silent street. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The person was still too far away for me to make out their face, but the closer they got, the more the world around me seemed to shift, to blur. I blinked, and for a split second, I thought I saw something flash behind them, something I couldn't quite make out. When they were almost within arm's reach, the stranger stopped. They stood there, staring at me, their features hidden by the shadows of their hood. I could feel the weight of their gaze, like they were seeing something in me that I couldn't see myself. My throat tightened, and I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figure turned and walked away, fading back into the darkness of the street. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to carry me forward. I glanced back at the alley, hoping to find some sense of familiarity, some way to anchor myself to the real world. But it was gone. The alley, the street, the sense of place, it had all shifted. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know where I was anymore. I started walking again, but this time, I didn't know where I was going. The street behind me seemed to vanish the further I walked. The buildings, the cobblestones, they all began to blur into something unrecognizable. And as I kept walking, I realized I wasn't walking forward anymore. I was walking backwards, retracing steps I thought I had left behind, walking into a place that felt familiar and foreign at the same time. The world seemed to shift with every step, as if I were being pulled through time, through space, into something that I didn't belong in. The alley, the street, the figure, none of it made sense. But one thing was clear. I wasn't in control anymore. The street was leading me, and I had no idea where it was taking me. It was a calm evening, the kind where the world felt like it was slowing down for the night. The city buzzed softly in the background, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional voice of a passerby. I was sitting on the rooftop of my apartment building, a place I often retreated to when I needed some space, some quiet. The breeze was cool, brushing against my face as I looked out at the horizon, where the sun was dipping lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It should have been peaceful, but tonight, it felt different. I wasn't sure why at first. The air was still, the evening quiet, but there was a strange tension in the atmosphere. Something felt off, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced up at the sky, and that's when I saw it. The sky was changing. The first hint of it was subtle, a shift in the colors. The warm oranges and pinks began to darken, the sky turning a deeper, more vibrant shade of red. At first, I thought it was just the sunset, some strange effect from the clouds, but then it didn't stop. The red deepened, turning the sky into a blood-like hue, stretching over the entire horizon. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. I didn't know what I was seeing, but it wasn't natural. The clouds above me started to shift, twisting in strange patterns, like they were being pulled by invisible hands. I had never seen clouds move like that, so erratically, so deliberately. The shapes they formed were strange, alien, almost purposeful. I couldn't shake the feeling that the sky itself was alive, that something was happening that I couldn't understand. And then, the words began to form. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint flicker in the clouds, like the last remnants of a dream slipping through the cracks of reality. But then, the letters became clearer, their shapes distinct against the swirling red backdrop. The words began to take shape, each one sharp and deliberate, hanging in the air like a message from somewhere far beyond my comprehension. Asterisk look. Asterisk, the word was clear, large and bold, as if the sky was trying to speak directly to me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't understand. The clouds shifted again, this time moving faster, swirling into new shapes, new words. Asterisk wake up. Asterisk, the letters flickered, shifting across the sky, almost like they were being written in real time, as if the clouds themselves were ink on a page, forming messages just for me. The chill that ran through my body had nothing to do with the wind, it was something deeper, a primal fear that whispered to me that this wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was something intentional. I backed away from the edge of the roof, my pulse quickening, but the words kept coming. The sky was no longer just a backdrop to the evening, it had become something alive, something aware. Asterisk, you're not alone. Asterisk, I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the steps as I turned away from the rooftop ledge. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sky, though. The words were still there, twisting and turning in the red expanse. They weren't just random letters, not just a trick of the mind. They were directed, aimed at me, or perhaps at someone else, but I was caught in the middle of it. Asterisk, remember. Asterisk, I couldn't breathe. The words seemed to be suffocating me, filling the air with a pressure I couldn't escape. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. I wasn't imagining it. The letters were real. The sky itself was communicating with me. I wanted to look away, to retreat inside, but something kept me rooted to the spot, something pulling me toward the unfolding message in the sky. Asterisk, it's time. Asterisk, the words lingered in the air, and for a moment, the sky seemed to hold its breath. Everything went still, like the world had paused, waiting for the next thing to happen. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the words began to fade, the letters dissolving into the swirling red clouds. The air around me felt charged, like the atmosphere itself was on the edge of something. I waited. I looked up, hoping for more, but the sky was silent now. The clouds had returned to their natural state, drifting lazily in the now darkening sky. The red hue slowly began to fade, the colors returning to normal as the sun sank lower, disappearing behind the horizon. But I knew that something had changed. That what I had seen wasn't just a strange trick of nature. The sky had spoken to me, or at least it had tried to. The message was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, a feeling that wouldn't go away. As I stood there, staring at the fading colors, I couldn't shake the thought that there was something I was supposed to do, something I was supposed to remember. The sky had given me a warning, or a sign, or a call to action. And I was left standing on the roof, alone, unsure of what to do with it. What did it all mean? Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more, something hidden just beneath the surface of the world I thought I knew? I didn't have any answers. But I couldn't ignore the feeling. The sky had spoken to me. And whatever it had said, whatever it was telling me, was far from over. It was a quiet night, the kind where the world seems to settle into a gentle rhythm, and time slows down. I had just come home after a long day, one of those days where everything felt like it was moving too fast. The evening air was cool, and as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of my apartment welcomed me. I took a deep breath, letting the comfort of being home wash over me. It had been a hectic week, and all I wanted now was a quiet night, a good book, and some peace. I made my way to the living room, where the soft glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the curtains. The room was mostly dark, save for the faint light from the windows and the dim light from the hallway. I walked over to the lamp on the side table, a small, cozy lamp that had always been reliable, always giving off just the right amount of light. The switch was familiar to me, an old, worn knob that I had turned hundreds of times before. I reached for it, expecting the usual warm glow to fill the room, but nothing happened. The room stayed dark. I frowned, puzzled. Maybe the bulb had burned out, or perhaps there was an issue with the wiring. I didn't think much of it at first, just a small inconvenience, easily fixed. I went to the switch again, giving it a gentle flick, but the lamp remained dark. I glanced at the bulb, it looked fine, no signs of it being broken or burned out. I tried again, twisting the knob once more, this time more firmly. But still, nothing. The darkness in the room remained, oppressive and thick, like it was wrapping itself around me, pushing in from all sides. A sense of unease began to settle in my chest. The lamp was old, yes, but it had never failed me before. It had always worked, always illuminated the room, giving it a soft, comforting light that felt like home. But now, it felt different. I took a step back, staring at the lamp, as if waiting for it to suddenly flicker on. But there was nothing. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer, as if the dark corners of the space were growing, creeping forward in a slow, deliberate way. I felt an irrational urge to leave, to step out of the room, but my feet stayed planted. I tried again, this time pressing the switch in different ways, up, down, side to side, but nothing worked. The room remained cloaked in darkness. It wasn't just the lamp that felt off. The whole room seemed to feel wrong. The familiar objects, my bookshelf, my armchair, the pictures on the wall, they all looked strange in the dark, distorted by the lack of light. It felt as though they were all slightly out of place, like the furniture had shifted when I wasn't looking, or the shadows had begun to change their shapes. I went over to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly to peek outside, hoping for some clarity, but the world outside was just as dark. The streetlights were off, and the buildings in the distance were swallowed by the night, no light visible, no movement. Just an empty, quiet street, as still as the room I was in. I turned back to the lamp again. There was no reason for it to be malfunctioning, no reason why it wouldn't work. I felt my pulse quicken, the air growing heavier with each passing second. I reached for the lamp's cord, pulling it out of the socket, then plugged it back in, thinking that maybe there was some loose connection. But when I turned the knob again, the room stayed dark. That was when I heard it. A faint noise, like the quietest whisper, coming from the darkness in the corner of the room. It was barely perceptible, a soft rustling sound, like something, or someone, was moving, just out of sight. My skin prickled, and I stepped back, my heart starting to race. I tried to calm myself. It was just my imagination. I had been working too much, my mind was tired. But the whisper came again, this time more distinct, a low, slow murmur that seemed to echo off the walls. It sounded almost like my name, though it was too soft, too distant to be sure. I spun around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the same dark room, the same shadows stretching longer and longer, encroaching on the edges of the space. My breath caught in my throat. Something felt wrong. The darkness felt alive. It wasn't just the absence of light anymore, it felt like the room itself was watching me, waiting for me to do something. I turned back to the lamp once more, my hand trembling as I reached for the switch again. But this time, when I touched it, the air around me shifted. The lamp, for just a moment, flickered as though it was struggling, fighting against some unseen force. I pulled my hand away, but the light never came. I stood there in the growing silence, the shadows closing in, the whispers getting louder, until they filled the space around me, thick and suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, everything went quiet. The lamp remained dark. The room was still. The only thing I could hear now was my own breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but when I finally left the room, I didn't turn the light on again. The dark felt wrong, felt like it wasn't my own anymore. I stayed away from that lamp for the rest of the night, the whispers still lingering in the back of my mind, reminding me that sometimes, darkness isn't just the absence of light. Sometimes, it's something else entirely. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the sun shines just bright enough to make you feel warm but not too hot to sit outside. I had spent most of the morning inside, working on a few things that had kept me preoccupied, but by midday, the need for fresh air had become undeniable. I decided to take a walk in the park, a small green space just a few blocks away from my apartment. It was a place I visited often, a calming spot to escape the noise of the city, with its rows of trees and paths winding between small flower beds. As I walked through the park's entrance, the familiar sense of damp earth and grass filled my lungs, and for a moment, I let myself relax. The park was quiet, but it wasn't empty. There were a few people walking dogs, a couple of joggers, and some children playing in the distance. The trees above me were thick with leaves, the soft rustling of them in the breeze creating a comforting backdrop to the otherwise still air. I walked along the familiar path, enjoying the peace, letting my mind wander, when I spotted her. She was standing near the large oak tree at the edge of the park, one of the oldest trees there, its branches sprawling like arms ready to embrace the sky. At first, I didn't recognize her, but there was something about her presence that seemed familiar. She was smiling, her face lit by the warm sunlight filtering through the leaves, and she waved at me. For a moment, I thought maybe she was someone I had met in passing, maybe a neighbor, or an acquaintance I had run into somewhere else. I smiled back and waved, ready to say hello when I got closer. But as I continued walking toward her, I realized that there was something strange about her. She was standing too still, as though she wasn't just waiting for me to approach but waiting for something else. Her smile was almost too perfect, too calm, and the more I looked at her, the more it seemed like I was looking at a reflection in a window, someone I should know, but couldn't quite place. I took a few more steps toward her, still confused, but then something caught my attention. The trees around us, the ones that had always been there, the ones that defined this part of the park, had begun to shift. Not in a way that made any sense. It was subtle at first, just the faintest rustle, as though the wind was making the leaves move in strange patterns. But then the trees started to fade. I blinked, my gaze snapping back to the park in front of me. The trees, the trees, had vanished. Just gone. The space where the oak tree had stood was now empty, and the wide, green expanse of the park was barren. There was no grass, no flowers, no soft brown earth underfoot. It was all gone, replaced with a strange, oppressive emptiness. I looked back at the woman. She was still there, standing where the tree had been, her smile unwavering, but now there was an odd, otherworldly quality to it. Her figure seemed sharper, more defined, like she didn't belong here. The longer I looked at her, the less she seemed like a person and more like a memory, an illusion I had somehow conjured. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, a cold shiver running down my spine. I wanted to call out to her, to ask what was going on, to demand an explanation for what I was seeing. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. I looked around, hoping to see the park as it was, hoping to see the trees return, the people walking, the dogs barking. But the world was empty, just a barren field stretching endlessly into nothingness. I turned back to the woman, my breath caught in my throat. She hadn't moved. She was still standing there, a perfect figure frozen in place. I took a tentative step back, unable to tear my eyes away from her. The silence was suffocating now, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, as though the world had decided to show me the truth all at once, the park started to return, but it wasn't the same star. The trees reappeared slowly, like they were being painted back into existence. The grass began to grow again, the flowers blooming in bursts of color. But everything was wrong. The trees were twisted, their trunks bent in unnatural angles, their branches reaching out like fingers clawing at the sky. The ground beneath me was cracked, the flowers wilting, their colors fading into dull, lifeless shades. I glanced back at the woman again, but this time, she wasn't standing where I had last seen her. She was gone. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know why the park felt so distorted, so out of place, or why I was now standing in the middle of a park that didn't make sense. But when I looked back at the spot where she had waved to me, where she had stood, I saw something else. The trees were gone again, replaced with nothingness. The ground beneath me had become flat and gray, like the park had never existed. I blinked and, in that brief moment of confusion, I found myself standing at the entrance to the park once again, just as I had when I first arrived. The trees were there, as they should be, the grass underfoot soft and familiar. The world was as it had always been. But something had shifted. Something had changed, and I couldn't tell if it was the world around me or something inside me. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it, but when I looked back toward the spot where the woman had been, she was still gone. I don't know what happened that day, or if I'll ever understand what I saw. But every time I pass the park now, I feel the pull of that moment. That fleeting, strange encounter. I can still see her, her smile, her face, waiting for me in the distance. And every time I walk past the park, I can't help but wonder if I'll find myself walking into the same place I left hours ago. It had been a long day, one of those that felt like it would never end. I had spent hours in meetings, listening to voices drone on about things that didn't seem to matter much anymore. By the time I stepped outside, the world felt like it was in slow motion, like time had dragged on too long and the evening was finally catching up. I decided to take a walk. The city had that late afternoon feel to it, where the streets are quieter, the hustle starting to fade, and people are just trying to make it to the end of their day. The sun was setting, casting a soft, amber glow over the buildings, and I needed the space, the air, to clear my mind. I wandered toward the bridge, the one that I always crossed when I needed to clear my head. It was a bridge that spanned over the river, connecting the older part of the city with the newer districts. I didn't know why it had always felt like a place of transition for me. Maybe it was the way the water below reflected the sky, or how the bridge felt like a threshold between two different worlds, two different lives. I started to cross, the cool breeze brushing against my face, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the hum of distant traffic. The river below moved lazily, its surface glinting in the fading light. It was peaceful, calming, and I let myself get lost in the quiet rhythm of the moment. But then something happened. I reached the middle of the bridge, where I always paused to take in the view. But this time, I felt it. The moment when the world seems to shift, just slightly, but enough to make you question what's real. The air around me thickened, and the sounds of the city seemed to fade, swallowed by a sudden silence that pressed in on me. I looked out over the water, and everything felt off. The buildings across the river, the streetlights in the distance, they looked familiar, yes, but they were wrong. Something had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed into a place that wasn't quite where I thought I was. I shook it off. It was just exhaustion. I'd been working too much, too hard. A little disorientation was normal, right? I continued walking to the other side of the bridge, but as I stepped off, I realized something strange. The street in front of me wasn't the one I expected. It was the same street I had just walked down before I had even crossed the bridge. The buildings were the same, the street signs identical, the same cars parked along the curb. I paused. I blinked. I looked around again, trying to make sense of it. I had crossed the bridge to go to the other side of the city, to walk through different streets, but now, somehow, I was back on the same street I had been on before. I shook my head, walking forward, hoping to make sense of what was happening. I turned the corner, my mind racing with thoughts, but when I reached the next intersection, I found myself facing the same street again. The same shops, the same people walking by, the same cars. A cold shiver ran through me. I crossed the bridge again, faster this time, thinking that maybe I had made some mistake, that I hadn't really been paying attention. The bridge looked the same, the river was still flowing beneath it, but when I reached the other side, I was again standing in the exact same place. The street was the same as before, the buildings were unchanged. It was like I hadn't gone anywhere. I was stuck, trapped in the loop of the same streets, the same buildings, and I couldn't figure out why. Panic started to creep in. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, the sensation of walking in circles, of being unable to escape. I tried to retrace my steps, tried to go back the way I came, but each time I crossed the bridge, I ended up on the same street. It didn't matter how far I walked, how many turns I took, everything looked the same. It was like the city had folded in on itself, trapping me in an endless loop of familiarity. I couldn't remember how many times I had crossed the bridge now. The streets were starting to blur together. The buildings seemed to warp and shift as I walked, and the people around me felt like ghosts, figures that I should recognize, but whose faces kept changing every time I turned my head. I started to run, my breath coming faster, the sound of my feet pounding on the pavement louder than it should have been. I crossed the bridge again, this time not stopping to look, not stopping to question anything. I just ran until the sound of the city grew muffled, and the streets twisted around me. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, but I couldn't stop. Finally, when I reached the other side again, breathless, dizzy, and lost, I stopped. I looked up at the bridge, the one I had crossed so many times, and I realized something. The bridge was no longer there. The river had disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like a wall, as if the world had collapsed in on itself. The street was still there, but the landscape around it had changed, twisted into something unrecognizable. I felt the weight of the emptiness press against me, the realization that I was no longer in the world I knew. The bridge had vanished, and I was left standing in the middle of something that shouldn't have existed. The city had swallowed itself, the streets turning in on themselves, trapping me in a place where nothing made sense anymore. And as I looked around, the only thing that was clear to me was that no matter how many times I crossed the bridge, I would always find myself here, on the same street. Forever lost in the loop of something that never ends. I crossed the bridge again. But as we ventured deeper into the outskirts, something felt wrong. The further we went, the fewer lights there were, and the further apart the stops became. The landscape outside the window shifted, the cityscape turning into fields and stretches of empty land. And then, without warning, the train slowed. I looked up from my phone, my brow furrowing. We weren't approaching a station, and there hadn't been any announcement. The train's brakes hissed, and then it stopped completely, the silence in the car suddenly too loud. The soft hum of the lights, the gentle sway of the train, all of it seemed to freeze. The landscape outside the window had gone completely dark, the only illumination the faint glow of the train's lights reflecting off the tracks. I glanced around at the few passengers still aboard, but they were all as silent as I felt. No one seemed concerned. No one moved. The train sat motionless in the dark, as though we had been abandoned. There wasn't a station in sight, just the empty stretch of tracks cutting through an endless void of darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just a delay, maybe something with the engine or a signal issue. But the unease in my chest grew. My phone had no signal, and there were no announcements, no way of knowing what was happening or how long we'd be stuck here. I stood up, unsure if I should do something, go to the conductor, check the door, anything, but there was no movement from the other passengers. No one was speaking. They were all sitting, looking straight ahead, their eyes vacant, their bodies still. It was like they were waiting for something. I walked toward the front of the train, past the empty seats, until I reached the door to the conductor's cabin. I knocked softly, but there was no answer. I turned the handle, only to find it locked. I pressed my ear against the door, hoping to hear something, anything, but all I could hear was the faint, steady pulse of the train's power. It was an ordinary train ride, the kind where the world feels distant, like the rumble of the tracks beneath you is the only thing that exists. I was headed home after a long day at work, the kind of day that drags you through endless tasks and deadlines, leaving you feeling like you've run a marathon by the time it's over. The train was relatively quiet, only a few people scattered around the car, lost in their own worlds, the sound of the train's wheels clicking rhythmically against the tracks providing a strangely soothing backdrop. I stared out the window, watching the city blur past as we made our way through the outskirts, the buildings growing sparse and replaced by empty fields and distant trees. The sky was beginning to darken, the last remnants of the sun casting a soft, golden hue over everything, and I felt myself starting to relax, my mind wandering to thoughts of home. As the train slowed, the familiar announcement crackled through the intercom, next stop, Maple Avenue. I looked up, hearing my stop announced, but something about the way it sounded made my chest tighten. Maple Avenue. I had been on this same train 100 times, but the name of the stop didn't sit right. It was the next stop I was expecting, but something about the announcement felt off. The tone of the voice didn't match the usual automated, monotonous delivery. It had a strange weight to it, as if it were a warning, something more than just a transit announcement. I stood up, the dull ache of exhaustion still in my limbs, and moved toward the door. The train began to slow even more, coming closer to the station, and I glanced out the window to get a better sense of where I was. But when I looked outside, nothing looked familiar. The train was still moving, but the view through the window was different. There was no sign of the usual station, no familiar platforms, no city lights, no bus stops or parking lots. Instead, there was a long, dark stretch of tracks ahead, and the dimly lit station platform in the distance was barely visible. It didn't look anything like Maple Avenue. It wasn't the stop I recognized. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced back toward the door. The train was almost at a stop now, the sound of the wheels slowing growing louder in the quiet of the car. I could hear the faint murmur of passengers as they shifted in their seats, preparing to get off. But the feeling of dread inside me kept growing, creeping up my throat, the realization settling in that something was wrong. The train stopped with a faint jolt, and the doors opened with a hiss. The platform outside looked empty, the harsh yellow lights casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the concrete. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then the train announcer's voice came again, clear and precise. "Maple Avenue," it said. "End of the line." I looked out the window once more, my heart racing. The station was deserted. The platform stretched out into the distance, empty, as if the stop had been abandoned long ago. No one had disembarked from the train, and there was no sound of movement from outside. Just a strange, oppressive silence that hung in the air. I looked at the people around me, but they didn't seem to notice. They were all standing, heading for the doors, ready to leave. I stood frozen, staring out at the empty station, wondering if I had somehow missed something, if I had gotten off at the wrong stop in a daze. But as the doors slid open and the passengers began to exit, I felt an overwhelming pull to stay on the train. Something told me I shouldn't get off. Not here. Not at this station. I stayed seated, watching the people filter out, their figures vanishing into the strange, desolate landscape. The train remained still for a moment longer, the doors still open, the silence pressing in around me. And then, the doors closed, and the train began to pull away from the station. The view outside the window changed again. The platform disappeared from sight, and the city came back into view, familiar streets and lights flickering in the distance. The train picked up speed, moving smoothly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. Something important. The train continued on, and I watched the city pass by as we moved further from that empty station, but the question started to build inside me. What had just happened? Why hadn't anyone else seemed as confused as I was? Why had the train stopped in a place that didn't exist, and why did the announcer call a stop that wasn't right? By the time I arrived at my actual stop, the Maple Avenue stop, the unease had settled into a tight knot in my chest. I stood up, ready to leave, but the feeling of having crossed into a different reality, a place where time or logic didn't seem to apply, stayed with me. The doors slid open, and the usual sounds of the station greeted me, familiar faces, the sound of the escalators, the low buzz of commuters. I stepped off the train, but I didn't feel like I had truly arrived. I glanced back at the train as it pulled away, the lights of the station reflecting off its metal surface. It felt like I was walking away from something, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. And then, in the distance, the faint sound of the announcer's voice floated through the air again. "Maple Avenue," it said, clear and unshaken. I stopped walking, my heart skipping a beat. There was no way. I hadn't imagined it. The voice, the train, the platform. Everything about it was too real, too vivid. But there was no turning back now. I had crossed the line, walked into a space between the familiar and the unknown, and now I was left wondering if I had truly reached my destination, or if I was still somewhere between stops, caught in a place that didn't exist. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air smells like dry leaves and damp earth, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. I was walking home from the cafe, my usual route, the one I'd taken countless times before. The city around me was quiet, the hum of traffic far off in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind the only sound in the otherwise still night. I had headphones in, lost in my thoughts, trying to unwind after a long day. As I passed down the familiar street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as though someone had stepped into my peripheral vision, but when I turned, no one was there. The street was empty, the houses on either side silent and dark. Still, the feeling didn't go away. It was like someone was watching me, following me, but when I glanced around, there was nothing but the usual shadows stretching across the pavement. I paused for a moment, taking out my headphones and standing still in the middle of the sidewalk, trying to listen, to sense something. There was no sound. No footsteps. No voices. Just the soft rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of a tree branch swaying in the breeze. The street was eerily empty, as if the world around me had paused, waiting for something to happen. I felt foolish. Maybe it was nothing, I thought. Asterisk, just my mind playing tricks. Asterisk, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, deepening with every step I took. I quickened my pace, the sound of my shoes against the pavement louder than before, but that sense of being watched didn't fade. It was like there was an unseen presence behind me, moving with me, keeping pace. I looked around again. Still no one. Just the quiet houses, their windows dark, their doors closed. The streetlights above flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the ground, and I wondered if I was imagining it all. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the weight of the day was getting to me. But then, as I reached the corner of the street, I turned to glance down the alleyway that cut through the block. I don't know why I did it, I wasn't planning on going that way, but as my gaze shifted, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A figure, standing at the far end of the alley, hidden in the darkness. I couldn't make out their features, but I could see their silhouette, tall and unmoving. They were just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes locked on the figure, unable to move. I couldn't see their face, but I knew, without a doubt, that they were looking at me. That feeling of being watched, the one that had been creeping up on me for the last few minutes, was suddenly real, undeniable. I wanted to run, to turn around and get away from that alley, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. I stood there, staring at the shadowy figure, waiting for them to move. But they didn't. They just stood still, motionless, watching. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat quickening. The alley was too far to run to, and I couldn't just stand there. The tension in my chest grew heavier with every second, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Asterisk, who was that? What did they want? Why weren't they moving? Asterisk, and then, just as suddenly as I had noticed them, the figure vanished. No movement. No sound. Just gone, as if they had never been there at all. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The alley was empty again, the darkness swallowing up the spot where the figure had been. I felt the air shift, as though something had changed. The street felt quieter now, more oppressive, as though the world around me had closed in. I took a step forward, my legs shaky, the unease in my chest growing stronger. I didn't dare glance back at the alley, afraid that if I did, the figure would be there again, staring, waiting. I quickened my pace, my footsteps louder now, almost frantic, as if I were running from something. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, of something following, waiting for me to slip up, to turn around, to look back. When I finally reached the end of the street and turned the corner, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The street was still empty. No one was behind me. Nothing moved. The houses were dark, and the streetlights flickered as they always did. But the feeling didn't go away. Even now, as I sit in the safety of my apartment, the unease lingers. The sense of being watched, of something, or someone, hidden just beyond my vision, still follows me. I can't explain it, but I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I've been trying to shake it off, to tell myself that I was just imagining it, that it was just the quiet of the night playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I can't ignore it. Something was there, something in the shadows, and no matter how hard I try to forget, I can still feel the weight of those unseen eyes on me.